Morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us. I'm really excited to introduce today's webinar, Key Issues to Watch at COP30. This is a annual event that is co-hosted by Second Nature, University Climate Change Coalition, UC3, and the Research and Independent NGO Constituency Group. My name's Anna McGinn, and I'm the Policy Director at the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, which is based in the US, and I'm also a member of the RINGO Steering Committee, which brings me here today. You're going to get to hear from a host of great experts today, and we are really grateful for their participation. We also have a big team behind the scenes that makes this webinar possible. So I just want to take a moment to thank the folks at Second Nature that help make all the logistics possible. A huge thank you to Beth Martin of Washington University in St. Louis, who's RINGO's co-focal point and fearless leader. She's not able to join us today, but a million thanks to her for everything she does. And a huge thanks to Marjorie Kaplan as well of Rutgers University, who leads the organization of this event and keeps us all in line to make this possible. So huge thanks to everybody. We are going to talk through program logistics for just a moment here before we jump into the substance. So this program is being recorded, which means if you love today's webinar and want to watch it again, you can absolutely do that. It will be posted on the Second Nature website and on the RINGO website. And you can see the links to those here. We would love to hear your questions. We will try to respond to them at the end when we have time for Q&A, but feel free to drop those in the chat throughout the session today. I also wanted to point you to a couple other resources that are available if you want to learn more about COP. So there's a couple COP preparation webinars that we recorded a couple years ago, but still have a lot of salient information on them. One's an overview of the UNFCCC process, the negotiations and the structure, and another is about the COP bodies and issues. And so check those out on the RINGO website as well. Also wanted to mention that the early career RINGOs organized a series of Ask Me Anythings, AMAs, just over the last couple weeks. And those are recorded and on the RINGO website. And if you click right on COP preparations in the main menu there, you can jump right to those. Lots of helpful information there as well. For today's event, we have 7 presenters joining us, and we'll have the Q&A after, as I mentioned. And so without further ado, I am just going to jump into introducing them. You can see here all the content we are going to cover. So I don't want to take a lot of time with the introductions because there's a lot to learn. So we can jump to our next slide here, which is going to talk us through our presenters. So unfortunately, Pedro is not able to join us today, but pinch hitting for him, we have Matti Goldberg, who's going to join us first. Matti works for Woodwell Climate Research Center. And I thought for these introductions, because I'm introducing so many people at once, I'm just going to give you like one fun fact about each of them to remember them by. So for Matti, he recently published a book called Climate Security, the Role of Knowledge and Scientific Information in the Making of a Nexus. Following Matti, we are going to hear from Danielle Falzon. She is an assistant professor of sociology at Rutgers University, and her current research focuses in 2 sites, the UN climate negotiations and the field of climate adaptation work in Bangladesh. On the next slide, we have our next 2 presenters. So following Danielle, we will hear from Melissa Lowe. Melissa is a research fellow at the National University of Singapore, and she's also the co-focal point of RINGO, our co-fearless leader with Beth Martin. And a fun fact I learned about Melissa is that she co-founded a book swap called Books and Beer to encourage recycling and reading, which sounds pretty fun. Then we'll hear from Damon Jones. He is from the UNFCCC Secretariat, and Damon has been involved in the UNFCCC negotiations since 2003, when he provided support to the Alliance of Small Island States as a volunteer lawyer at the Foundation for International Environmental Law and Development. Next, we get to hear from Axel. Axel is from Perspectives Climate Research, and he is a founding member of RINGO, which means he has been around since the very beginning and has served on the steering committee since it was first established, which we are all very grateful for. Then we get to hear from Shika. Sheikha is also a member of the RINGO Steering Committee, and she works for the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water. And according to her official bio on the CEEW website, she has rescued 4 sea turtles and drinks an average of 6 cups of black coffee a day. She's also the leader of the Ringo Technology Thematic Group. So if you're interested in what's going on with technology topics, definitely get in touch with Sheikha on that. On the next slide, we get to our last but not least presenters. So we're going to hear from Edda Kozma. Edda is with the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, and she is also the leader of Ringo's Finance Thematic Group. And prior to joining C2S, she did a stint with the UNFCCC's Transparency Division in Bonn, Germany. Finally, we'll get back to where we started and have Matti join us again for another piece of his presentations. So with that, we are going to jump right in. Matti, I will hand it over to you to get us started.
Okay, yeah, thank you, and hi everyone. Great to be part of this webinar. Sorry, I think I had a little internet glitch there, but seems to be working fine. Okay, yeah, I am happy to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about the overall COP strategy. I am sorry you can't hear Pedro's version, and you'll just have to live with my version this time, but it's just one of the many readings of what's going to happen. I can't speak for the presidency, but what I've been doing in the last few weeks is to kind of try to decipher these 7 letters that the presidency has been sharing throughout the year. Those letters outline the presidency's plan in different parts of the COP preparations. And they are good to read. Some of them are very abstract, but others are actually quite concrete in terms of what the ideas are. So on this slide here, I've been trying to distill the essence of the strategy that's in those letters. The first thing that is pretty clear that the presidency has articulated many times are these 3 strategic objectives. So they want to prove that multilateralism works, they want to connect the UNFCCC with real lives, and they want to bring about some structural changes to advance Paris implementation. And in order to pursue these objectives, my reading is that there's this sort of what I just call it a toolbox. These are kind of the 7 different ways that the presidency has emphasized as the tools for for pursuing these strategic objectives. And obviously the first one there are the formal negotiations, and these are obviously not in full control of the presidency, since their structure and issues are determined by the agendas of the different UNFCCC bodies. But the presidency, of course, has a major role in convening people together and trying to find consensus and steering the process in a transparent way. One interesting thing, of course, here in the formal negotiations is there's a big question mark around the NDCs. We've had a push from many countries to talk about the NDCs in a very robust way, and from others, have been less excited about. But we'll hear more from Melissa about that. In terms of the other parts of the toolbox, these tend to be a bit more under the control of the presidency. So the second thing there is what Brazil calls the global mutirão. Apologies for my pronunciation. And this seems to be an effort for stakeholders at all levels to share their contributions and provide sort of a bottom-up mobilization movement for this COP, and this is something that the presidency says would be supported and steered by the high-level champions, by the youth champion and the special envoys. The third thing is that they've emphasized is the action agenda, and this is I would say a continuation of the action agenda that we've known since 2012, 2013, where non-state actors announced pledges and targets. And in this case, Brazil has taken the initiative of restructuring this action agenda thematically around the outcomes of the first global stocktake. So they want to connect that agenda much more closely with what came out of the global stocktake and hopefully provide a bit more common direction through that move to the work at different levels. Then obviously, as like every COP, there are thematic days. In this case, they are kind of doubled 2 days per kind of a broad range of thematic areas, and you can see those on the COP30 website. And as usual, the plan seems to be that there's different thematic targeted events on those days. There might be some announcements, etc. Another innovation there are these circles that the presidency has put together. There's 4 of them, and they my understanding is that they serve mostly as kind of an advisory and guiding units for different topics. So there's they're bringing together the presidencies of the last 10 COPs to provide process advice and to advise on the big policy issues. I don't know exactly what they're doing, but they've been announced in the letters. There's a circle of finance ministers to help with the big finance issues that will be also very prominent at this COP. There's a circle of indigenous representatives. I think it's called Circle of Peoples to provide guidance on that. And then there's the global ethical stocktake led by Marina Silva that tries to bring sort of a broader normative and moral perspective to the conversation. Then we have the Leaders Summit, which is starts in a couple of weeks. Time flies. And I don't know, I have not seen an agenda. If someone has, then please mention or post it on the chat. But this, as usual, would give momentum to the COP on the big policy issues. And then finally, Brazil has outlined a few initiatives from their own side, in particular, the Tropical Forest Forever Fund. They've discussed that quite a bit. So things related to forestry are very much obviously on their radar. And there's, for example, something called the Global Initiative on Information Integrity on Climate Change, which tries to fight disinformation around this issue. So that's my reading of the things, but I would encourage everyone to read the letters, and hopefully this provides a good framing and starting point. And I'm sure Pedro would have had a much more comprehensive and clear version, but yeah, I hope this helps nevertheless. Thanks. And I'll hand it over to Danielle Falzon from Rutgers University to start talking about adaptation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matti. And I'll wait for the slide, Joel. And you can flip one more and I'll get going. All right, so I'll be talking about one of the key issues and one of the key outcomes we're expecting to see at COP30, which will be under the agenda item, the global goal and adaptation. So just to give you an idea, this is something that they've been talking about for the last few years in the negotiations. When we talk about the global goal and adaptation, we're talking about Paris Agreement Article 7.1, which I have here on the slide. In short, there are 3 elements of the global goal and adaptation: to enhance adaptive capacity, to strengthen resilience, and to reduce vulnerability to climate change. And you'll see at the very end of that paragraph that this is all within the context of the temperature goal, which is the 1.5/2 degree goal referred to in Article 2 of Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. All right, now I'm going to go through this history very, very quickly, so I'm not going to give a lot of detail, but if people are curious, I can say more. In short, because that article that I just read, those 3 elements are so vague and there's no real specific detail on what it means to measure progress on that global goal and adaptation, parties have been working for the last 4 years to elaborate the global goal and adaptation. And this was sort of kicked off through an adaptation committee technical paper that was released in, as you can see there, April of 2021, that outlined a number of considerations for measuring progress on a global goal and adaptation. Next slide, please. And that kicked off the first of, in 2021 at COP26, that kicked off the first work program under the global goal and adaptation called the Glasgow Sharm el Sheikh work program, or the GLAS, you might hear it referred to. I won't get into details. Essentially, they started that work program not knowing quite what they were going to do to elaborate the goal, and they ended it deciding that there were going to be a set of targets and indicators for adaptation that they would develop. That they laid out the targets, which I'll discuss more in a second, but they laid out those targets at COP28 in Dubai. And they also initiated the UAE Belém work program on indicators through which they would develop the indicators to go under the targets. This was launched under something called the UAE Framework for Global Climate Resilience, often referred to as the framework, which is something you may hear. If you go to the COP28 decision text, you can learn a little bit more about that. And like I said, it's based on targets that were set in, or the indicators will be based on these targets that were set in Dubai, and there are two sets of targets. So if we can go to the next slide, please, I'll tell you about those. Okay, so you'll hear discussion if you follow the GGA on thematic and dimensional targets, or para 9 and para 10 targets. So the para 9 targets, paragraph 9 targets that's paragraph 9 of decision 2 CMA 5, the decision text from Dubai. And the thematic targets you can see are kind of sectoral or thematic, right? They're substantial areas where we might want to see adaptation progress. Water, food and agriculture, health, ecosystems and biodiversity, infrastructure, poverty and livelihoods, and cultural heritage. And then the dimensional targets, which are the para 10 targets, are the different stages of the adaptation policy cycle. So you have kind of the risk assessment stage, the planning stage, implementation, and the monitoring, evaluation, and learning, or MEL stage. And so the indicators that are developed are going under each of these targets. Next slide, please. Okay. So what has this process of developing indicators look like? So we're nearing the end. COP30, excuse me, will be the end of this 2-year work program on indicators. During the past 2 years of work program, they've had various workshops to decide kind of how that process would look, what that process would look like, excuse me. In fall 2024, they had finally selected a group of 78 experts who are kind of external to, or somewhat external to the UNFCCC process, experts in the substantive areas. And they are working in 8 groups. So there's one expert group for each of the thematic targets, and there's one expert group that's much larger for the dimensional targets. These experts, or the COP29 guidance, so last year in Baku, they decided that the parties decided that there would be no more than 100 indicators in the final indicator list, which was quite an interesting number because at the time there were about, or as you can see there, like almost 10,000, 9,529 indicators that had been suggested by various people or various entities as potential indicators for the GGA. By the SB, the meeting in June, the expert group had reduced that to 492 indicators, which the parties were not happy with. They really emphasized the 100, and the experts then worked really, really hard all summer until an expert meeting that happened in August to get that list down to 100, which is where it's currently at. And I can share that list of indicators if folks are interested in seeing it in the chat when I'm finished presenting. I'm short on time, so broadly, there were many considerations that the experts were given in reducing the set of indicators and generating this set. Adaptation relevance, so making sure the indicators are not mitigation or loss and damage indicators, for example. They had to be globally applicable but locally relevant. There's considerations about disaggregation. I can get into this more in the Q&A if folks want to know more about these considerations. One thing to highlight, though, is that at COP29 in Baku last year, they were given the mandate to include means of implementation indicators, which is finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. And that's significant because that's a very contentious and political issue in the COP. So currently there are 17 indicators that are indicated as MOI indicators. Next slide, please. And I'll wrap up with that, I believe. Okay, so very briefly, what to expect at COP30. Parties will agree on a final list of indicators, or that's what they are supposed to do. We can definitely expect conflict over these MOI indicators, specifically around finance. My guess is that we're going to have a very messy first week of discussions, and the ultimate decision will be pushed to the high-level discussions in the second week. Well, you might hear discussion about the Baku adaptation roadmap. I'm not going to get into that right now. No one really knows what it is yet. They're still deciding what it's going to be. You also might hear discussion about transformational adaptation, which has become a very highly political issue. That's also under the GGA agenda item. And that's all I'll say for now. I'm going to pass it to Melissa Lowe, who will be telling us more about the third round of nationally determined contributions.
Thanks, Danielle. It's great to be here with you. If you go to the next slide, I'll just start off by saying that, of course, 2025 is a pivotal year for climate action. This year, countries are expected to be submitting their new NDCs, nationally determined contributions. We call them NDCs 3.0. The reason for 3.0 is because the first set of NDCs, of course, was submitted in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was signed and adopted, followed by 2020. And then, of course, now it's 2025. The Paris Agreement, as many of you know, contains a 5-year ambition cycle. And so one of the reasons for a 5-year ambition cycle is also to ensure that the NDCs are informed by the global stocktake. And the first global stocktake, of course, had taken place at, 2 years prior, but concluded at COP28 in Dubai. And countries are, of course, expected to ensure that the NDCs are informed by the outcome of the first global stocktake. Of course, we had very much hoped that by now, the NDC synthesis report would have been released by the COP presidency or the UN FCCC Secretariat. However, I had a look at the website and I don't believe that it's out just yet. One of the reasons possibly for this is they're waiting for more NDCs to be submitted ahead of the COP. You'll see in the slide also I've mentioned, I think many people do miss this provision in the Paris Agreement. You do want to look at Decision 1 CP21 of the Paris Agreement, where paragraph 25 notes that NDCs have to be submitted 9 to 12 months ahead of the relevant COP, which would make the NDC submission deadline this year to be the 10th of February, 2025. At that time, only something like 13 countries had submitted their NDC 3.0, which makes 90% of countries having failed to meet this deadline. As of just a week ago, when I looked at the NDC 3.0 website, and I would strongly encourage anyone who's following NDC 3.0, I provided the links in the slides here, but you can very easily Google it. Only 62 countries have submitted their latest NDCs. And as I've said, the NDC synthesis report has not been released at this stage. If you go to the next slide, so here, I haven't updated this slide, but I've mentioned China. So China is one of those countries that has not submitted its NDCs 3.0, but at a recent carbon market conference, they had announced an intention to reduce their emissions by 7 to 10%. Note here that the base year has not been indicated or specified. They've also mentioned that they intend to decrease their use of fossil fuels in energy and so on and so forth. Early observations is that this could mean that China could emerge as a strong player, particularly in Article 6, and to set some standards. I would also like to mention that a number of analysis has come out about the NDCs 3.0, and the United Kingdom has emerged as having submitted one of the most ambitious NDCs to date. They've aimed for an 81% reduction in emissions by 2035 compared to 1990 levels, perhaps contributed by the Climate Change Act. The United Arab Emirates and Switzerland have also substantially increased their ambition, and Singapore has now put themselves on a downward trajectory from 2030 to 2035. It's on a downward trend to net zero by 2050. I will also say here on this slide that the WRI, the World Resources Institute, has published a short insight article. I'm happy to put that in the chat as well shortly after this. Their analysis is quite interesting. You'll see actually that there are many more ranges that have been submitted as NDCs 3.0, which just means that perhaps more countries are being a bit more modest and careful with where they're going to be at in 2035. I'm pretty sure that tariffs have to do with something, and we're just waiting and seeing when the NDC synthesis report. And of course, we hope that within the next couple of weeks, more countries will be submitting the NDCs. Now I would like to move on to transparency. So if we move on to the next slide. And then the following one as well. I just have 2 slides on enhanced transparency framework here. So I think many of you know that the Paris Agreement, as part of the Paris Agreement, the NDCs are just one portion. Countries do have to report progress in through the biennial transparency reports, which is part of the enhanced transparency framework. I can't go into a lot of detail in the few minutes that I have, but if anyone is interested, I would strongly encourage to look at the transparency page on the UNFCCC website. It will take you to a lot of history about transparency, including the MRV arrangements, which I would strongly also encourage you to read, because it, at least to me, it indicates preparedness and readiness for preparing the biennial transparency reports that are due as part of the enhanced transparency framework. Here, you would note that the first biennial transparency reports were actually due at the end of last year, 31st of December 2024. However, by that deadline, only 86 parties had submitted their first BTRs. I'm happy to report that as of mid this year, the number had reached 103 first biennial transparency reports. Note that this is still short of all of the countries, but it's helpful that many developing countries have already submitted their first biennial transparency reports. I would also point to a very helpful report published by the Secretariat, which details the experience of developing countries and some of the challenges that they face. The report does emphasize the role of funding, support, as well as early planning. So strongly encourage reading that report if there's interest in transparency. And I come to my second and final slide on transparency. So here, if any of you are attending COP30, I would encourage you to follow the Facilitative Multilateral Consideration of Progress. It's a bit of a mouthful, but you can call it FMCP for short. This is basically the interactive part of the Enhanced Transparency Framework. Once a country submits their biennial transparency report, the report will then undergo a technical expert review process. Usually it's desktop, but there might be an in-country review as well. And then this will be followed by a facilitative multilateral consideration of progress. If you followed transparency in the past, you will note some similarities, I believe, to the facilitative sharing of views for developing countries, but obviously the same goes for developed countries where they had an assessment process. The second workshop of the FMCP is will take place at SBI 63 in Belém during COP30 itself. And I've listed the countries that are participating. Essentially, these are countries who, again, like I said, have submitted their BTRs. And just to note also that the first workshop had taken place at SBI 62 earlier this year in Bonn, Germany, with Andorra, Guyana, and Panama. They were the first countries who have submitted their BTRs. So if you do plan to follow transparency and follow it meaningfully, my advice to you would be to look through the BTRs as well as the reports that have come out from the technical expert review. These will help you understand what parts of the review and areas of improvement that have been highlighted by the expert review team. It will make your life a lot easier if you also read the rulebook pertaining to the Enhanced Transparency Framework and understand what is expected of countries. So with that, I'm happy to pass the time over to Damon, who will cover the Just Transition Work Program. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and hello everyone. Great to be with you, and thanks for the opportunity to present today on the Just Transition Work Program. Just before I launch into that, just given that I am from the UNFCCC Secretariat, just following up from what Melissa said, I can confirm that both the next NDC synthesis report as well as the first BTR synthesis report will both be coming out before COP30, and they're not far away. So keep watching out for those on the website. But thanks, Melissa, very much for highlighting them, because they are going to be very important documents for the COP. So Just Transition Work Programme. I've only got a few minutes, so I'll just give a broad snapshot. I mean, this is another one of the key priorities for COP30, and something being prioritised by the incoming COP30 presidency, Brazil. It's very much a cross-cutting issue in the international climate negotiations, and really in the real world as well. It can be a strong enabler for more ambitious and accelerated climate action, and lots of activity happening outside the UNFCCC process as well as within it in this space. This slide here just represents the journey that the Just Transition Work Programme has had over its short lifetime since being established in 2022, and really operationalised the next year, and has been up and running in full flight since last year. And its activities centre around 2 dialogues each year on topics that are informed by the elements of the work programme outlined in the CMA decision from 2023 through CMA 5, as well as an annual high-level ministerial roundtable on just transition, which happens during COP each year, to provide that political momentum and focus on some of the issues very relevant to just transition, and it informs the dialogues and vice versa, and as well as the negotiations. Next slide, please. Here are the dialogues that have happened to date, going through a range of different topics, and really emphasising through these topics that the breadth of just transition is more than perhaps how some people view it historically, as being only focused on energy transition and workforce type issues. It's much broader, encompassing adaptation and support issues, international cooperation, and different aspects within each of those areas. And so those dialogues happen each year. From last year, this year will continue next year, and then there's a decision point next year in terms of the continuation of the work programme beyond 2026. Next slide, please. And so to the negotiations themselves, as some will know, there was a disappointing failure to have consensus on a substantive outcome at COP last year, COP29 in Azerbaijan, but really regained momentum through the mid-year negotiations in the Bonn session at what's called SB 62, where there was progress in terms of capturing elements potentially of a decision text framed in the form of an informal note, so not agreed text, still very much for further discussion and engagement in Belém, with quite some convergence around sort of the structure of a decision, potential elements to it, but also some very significant divergences reflected in the text as well, in the context of some of the issues that I've highlighted there in the middle column of the slide, including some really politically sensitive and divergent issues around how to frame the energy sector transition issues, the visibility of trade-related measures in the context of just transition, also this year a much broader issue in the context of the COP more generally, how finance and other support is reflected in there, and also the future of the work programme in the context of substantive outcomes, and whether that's integrating just transition into existing work streams and constituted bodies processes, or whether there's something new that's required to give extra visibility and focus in terms of the contribution of just transition more broadly to climate action. And so those will be in focus at the negotiations in Belém at COP30, and lots of work to be done between now and then to ensure that a strong substantive outcome is landed as part of the overall package. And with that, I'll leave it at that. And thanks again, and I'll pass over to Axel from Perspectives Climate Research to provide his presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So, of course, after the decisions in Baku, many people thought, okay, Article 6, so the international carbon market mechanisms is done in terms of negotiation. But we've seen a few developments over the year that make it likely that they will be, again, a rather contentious element. So on the slide, of course, you will now see the critical issues. So we have the Article 6.4 supervisory body, which has done a lot of work during the year, and which, of course, has addressed certain issues that parties don't agree on. And there is now an annual decision at the COP on guidance to the Article 6.4 supervisory body. And this gives the opportunity for parties to complain about decisions they don't like on the lower level of rules. And there is a lot of meat on the table, and especially in the last month, there has been a very contentious debate on how to determine permanence and reversal risks in the context of the Article 6.4 mechanism. There was a document that specified very clear rules how long activity developers have to monitor whether reversals occur after the end of the formal crediting period of the project, and also what would determine a so-called negligible risk of reversal. And a lot of business lobbyists weigh down on the supervisory body saying, oh, this is impossible. We cannot do any forestry projects or any nature-based projects at all. There were 70 submissions from these interest groups, and they even enlisted UNEP to lobby on their favor. And that meant that the supervisory body now essentially deferred the issue. So I'm expecting a very heated debate in this guidance decision, especially given that Brazil wants to have this as a forestry COP. And of course, if the forestry countries also, of course, will not like the original version of the rules, whereas, for example, EU and countries who want to have a really stringent, credible mechanism want to have these safeguards. So I'm expecting that discussion to become really heated. Next slide, please. And then, of course, now this discussion, as said, will focus in the future on each methodology, because as the compromise said, each methodology, so for example, for avoided deforestation or for geological storage, or there may be tens or dozens of activity types that have relevance in the context of reversals. And of course, if now this negotiation will be done in the context of each methodology, it will eat up a lot of budget at the UNFCCC. And the UNFCCC actually doesn't have enough budget for dealing with Article 6.4 matters. And that brings me now to the next issue. So next slide, please. Because we have another stream that is indirectly linked to Article 6. It's the so-called closure of the CDM. So CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, which was half dead for many years, but formally still continue. And now, given Article 6 is operational formally after Baku, there is an interest to stop the CDM. But there are conflicts about when to stop it, and also what to do with resources that are still available. And developing countries want to stop it as late as possible because there is still accumulated surplus of budget at the Secretariat. So the CDM could continue to operate for many years. But of course, each year of operation costs $7 million. And it's not really relevant anymore because, there are no CDM projects to come anymore. So ideally, of course, one would decide to close it as early as possible. So that would save us about $20 million. And then, of course, the question is what to do with these $20 million. And the developing countries have said it should go to the Adaptation Fund. The developed countries say it should be used for Article 6.4. But now, if one looks into the long term, of course, it would be much better to use it for Article 6.4, because Article 6.4 activities give 5% of the emission credits to be sold for the adaptation fund. So essentially, if you now give the money to the adaptation fund, you kill the goose that lays the eggs for the adaptation fund in the future. So again, seemingly very technical questions, but having really long-lasting consequences. So with that, yeah, I would like to close. And of course, unfortunately, our colleague Shira from CW, who was to report about technology mechanism, is unavailable. So we need to skip the technology mechanism and pass directly to Edda from C2ES to discuss climate finance. So Edda, please.
Thanks so much, Axel, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone. Now to talk about how countries will fund all of the important work that we've discussed this far. I'll be covering the highlights for climate finance at COP30. Next slide, please. And really, in the context of COPs, climate finance refers primarily to finance that developing countries need and receive in order to achieve their targets under the Paris Agreement and also the Convention to reduce emissions, increase resilience, enhance carbon sinks, and so forth. But before we can talk about what will happen at COP30, I wanted to briefly recap what's happened last year at COP29 in Baku. As some of you may know, and as we talked about in depth, the new collective quantified goal, or NCQG, as you'll hear it called, was a longstanding negotiation on finance to replace the $100 billion goal that came previously out of the 2009 Copenhagen negotiations. And really all that to say with the NCQG is that in Baku, parties were able to come to an agreement about how much money would be raised for developing countries. And so I'll cover it quickly, and it goes much more in depth, but essentially the numbers are $300 billion annually at least, that developed countries agreed to lead the way, with other countries also participating in providing and mobilizing for climate action in developing countries by 2035. And then also a separate goal to raise at least $1.3 trillion in total finance, public and private, also for developing countries. And notably, this 1.3 trillion number is the largest finance goal, to my knowledge, that's been set in a multilateral forum. So in terms of climate finance, the NCQG decision, there were a lot of mixed feelings about it's how exactly the negotiations went down. But the 1.3 trillion is really the number that parties are most interested in. And to make sure that it ultimately comes to fruition, they decided in the NCQG to lay forward or put out a map and make sure that countries would continue to talk about how they would scale finance. And this turned into the Baku to Belém roadmap to 1.3 trillion, which is the formal sort of working that's happened throughout this year. So the presidencies for COP29, as well as the Azerbaijanis and the Brazilian COP30 presidencies throughout this year have been very active in seeking input from parties, from constituency groups, including RINGO, and from other observer organizations. But really the meat of the work for the roadmap has been conducted under the Circle of Finance Ministers that was mentioned earlier. So in this case, about 35 countries were recruited by the Brazilians, representing a good, honestly, a good segment of the global economy. And that circle put out a report recently on their findings for what exactly they believe should go into the roadmap, which is a curated list of recommendations, really, that and reforms that governments could undertake to scale climate finance. The UN Secretary General's Independent High-Level Expert Group, or IH-LEG, was also involved in the drafting. And so really all this to say that the list of recommended reforms that will be included in the roadmap are things that have been talked about in the international community that's focused on climate finance has been aware of for quite some time. It's really just the first time that in aggregate we're seeing, not necessarily the first, but I'll say in this context and in under the Paris Agreement that these reforms will be coming together. So we'll see the roadmap published ahead of COP30. It's actually supposed to come out next week, so keep your eyes peeled for that. And in addition to that, there will be a high-level launch event at COP30, so in the first days. At the same time, there's not really a formal mandate for a decision to be taken by parties, and so it's not guaranteed that this will be included in the COP30 decision text. It's not outside the realm of possibility, but I think more importantly, it's really not clear if the contents of the roadmap will, how they will actually get implemented. So countries have yet to come forward with commitments to take forward specific recommendations. That was also notably something that was lacking from the release of the Circle of Finance Ministers report. So for those finance ministries that were involved did not commit themselves to taking forward those things. And so I think it's really yet to be seen whether or not an organization, like an international organization outside the UNFCCC or within the UNFCCC, what type of follow-up there will be to this roadmap. So next slide, please. Wonderful. So I have to go quickly because there are several different finance issues to cover, but in terms of outside of this roadmap, and relevant to some of the sort of headline negotiations that are happening around the global goal on adaptation, there's also the matter of the expiration of the Glasgow doubling adaptation finance goal to consider. So at COP26, developed countries pledged to double the amount of adaptation finance that they provided to developing countries by 2025. And so if taken from the 2019 baseline, that represented around $40 billion annually in adaptation finance that was to be provided by 2025. Because of data lags and certain things, we won't know if that goal's been met until 2027. But so far, we have 2022 data. We're expecting to see a progress update on that soon. But really the issue at hand is that goal is ending, and developing countries, in conversations around the indicators for adaptation are curious and demanding, honestly, a new adaptation finance goal that will guarantee funding for some of these priorities that are coming forward. So several negotiating groups, and including the least developed countries, have called for a tripling of adaptation finance in order to replace this goal. And depending on the base year, a tripling of that would really represent around $86 to $116 billion annually. But I think the big question for the adaptation finance goal is where in the decision text this type of goal could land. Would that be under the adaptation negotiations? That seems pretty unlikely given the stronghold that typically finance negotiators like to keep on things like this. And so but at the same, will this really constitute a reopening of the NCQG? So there are a lot of complications around whether or not an adaptation finance goal could come forward. But I think it's something that's certainly going to be a primary and possibly even a flashpoint at COP30. Separately, we're also seeing a greater demand for finance leverage generally. So outside the negotiations and geopolitically, we've seen a shrinking of national budgets in developed countries for not only funding for climate projects, but also for development aid. And so these things have taken a significant hit. And against this backdrop, and in the light of the NCQG's $300 billion goal, many developing countries are seeking more clarity for how developed countries will fulfill their obligations to provide climate finance that's outlined in Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement. So in June, during the SB's, the mid-year climate negotiations, we saw a pretty significant agenda fight over this. And I'll just say that, I've heard that we might anticipate this to a similar a negotiation around Article 9.1 in its place to come up again during COP30. Next slide, please. So the things that I've covered so far are actually not mandated for formal negotiations. Those are all informal negotiations that may or may not end up on their way into the formal COP decision. The only thing, not the only, but certainly the most significant climate finance negotiation that I think will happen at COP30 is around Article 2.1c. So what is Article 2.1c? And I know we don't normally try to read too much decision text, but the Article 2.1c is one of the three main objectives of the Paris Agreement, along with 2.1a around the emissions target and 2.1b around resilience. And so here we're really focused on making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And this is the only negotiations work stream to discuss this work of financial alignment. And so really this works at the typically at the national levels of what countries are doing to make sure that their finances are in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. But the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue on Article 2.1c and its complementarity with Article 9 has been ongoing since 2023. And at the same time, in the vein of expiration, it's set to end after COP30 unless it's extended by parties. It actually has yet to agree a common understanding of scope or not, like what even this financial alignment means in the context of the Paris Agreement. And so with this objective unmet, many would argue that it would need to continue these negotiations, but some parties are also a bit hesitant to continue, given that this might, continue on in the vein of a definition of climate finance. We don't want to come to an impasse that is ultimately unnegotiable, and so I think that the 2.1c conversation will continue to be interesting. And I think I'll stop here for now. But before I do, I'll just give a plug that if anyone's interested in learning more or will be at COP and focusing on finance, you can join the RINGO Finance Group, and you can find more information on the RINGO website. So now I'll hand it over to Mati to wrap us up and to talk about the global stock take. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Eda. I am gonna talk about two things. So first of all, I'll give you a bit of an overview of the GST, and since Beth could not be with us today, I would just highlight two RINGO priorities for this COP. Please bear with me if I just take a little bit longer. So starting with the global stock take, if we could go to the next slide, please. The GST is very hard to follow because it brings many things together and it's connected with almost everything, but here's my take of where things are. So let's start with a quick recap of the GST basics. So Melissa outlined the 5-year ambition cycle of the Paris Agreement, where parties submit NDCs every 5 years, they report every 2 years, and then the GST takes stock about the state of the global climate effort and makes recommendations for the next round of NDCs. And to prepare those recommendations, the GST will assess collective progress towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. And in doing that, it should consider all aspects of the effort: mitigation, adaptation, means of implementation, etc. And in particular, the effect of the NDCs, state of adaptation, and support. And the outcomes of the GST are recommendations to inform the next round of NDCs and international collaboration. So, global stocktake was outlined in the Paris Agreement. Its structure and its inputs were defined in the rulebook, and the first GST was conducted in 2021 to 2023. And the first GST drew basically together many of the existing work streams and gave direction to the global climate effort for the next 5 to 10 years. And Decision 1 CMA 5 is the place to go to look for those outcomes. It is probably 85% of the decision is recalling, recognizing, noting with concern, etc., etc. But there are also some very specific things in that decision, and new things, I would say. First one is that there are these global objectives relating to renewable energy, energy efficiency, fossil fuels, net zero energy systems, low emission technology, transportation, forests, adaptation, a whole range of kind of global aspirational goals. Then there's an encouragement to align the NDCs with the 1.5 limit. And then there's a bunch of new work streams, including the roadmap to Mission 1.5, an annual GST dialogue, technology implementation plans, etc. Quite a few other things, mountains dialogue, and such. And there's also an invitation to the IPCC to consider aligning its work with the GST. And in some ways, we are now at a kind of a critical point in this cycle of the Paris Agreement where this is the moment where the recommendations from the GST would be considered in national action and international cooperation. And of course, if this doesn't work out, then the cycle might become questioned in a much broader sense, but we'll see. But the big issue now seems to be, how do you follow up with these recommendations? And it gets particularly tricky in relation to the NDCs and these energy goals. And it is very connected to climate finance that Ida just discussed. So parties have struggled really to agree how you follow up on this cluster. And I'll just try to disentangle this a bit, but I probably don't know fully what's going on. But on the NDCs, there's basically the position from the EU, the Umbrella Group and AOSIS and some others is that keeping the global effort on track requires a follow-up on how parties have considered the GST recommendations in their 2025 NDCs. And these countries want the follow-up to look at all the aspects of the recommendations, be informed by a synthesis report of implementation of those recommendations, and lead to some kind of COP30 decision. But there's a very strong opposition fight from the LMDCs and the Arab group, because they say that the GST follow-up is mainly a national matter and it should be something that's captured in the NDCs. And the Paris Agreement does not have a kind of a big international space for considering and following up on these outcomes. They are saying that if we follow up, then it's going to turn into a mini GST, a GST within the GST, or something like a permanent follow-up process, which would be very unmanageable. And then, of course, they emphasize that if we follow up on the GST, then it should be about finance. And that connects very much to the challenges that Eda outlined. So where do these issues appear in the COP? Well, there's maybe two main things. One is this overall exchange of what to do about the NDCs. And for that, of course, there's no dedicated agenda item. Brazil has been trying to introduce this. They had consultations a few weeks ago, but they had quite a bit of backlash from the LMDCs about that. There is an agenda item where this appears. This is SBI agenda item 6B, which is the modalities of the UAE dialogue on implementing the global stocktake outcomes. This is not to be confused with the annual global stocktake dialogue, which is in different parts of the GST decision. And this dialogue should have started last year, and it would run until 2028, but parties have really struggled to agree on the focus. This is the same constellation. LMDCs say this is a finance dialogue, and EU and the others want attention to all the elements of the GST. So these are, in my interpretation, the two difficult questions and where they appear. There is also a less controversial item that aims to improve the logistics and procedures of the future GSTs. This is a joint SBI substa item. And the main issues seem to be how you enhance the scientific inputs to the GST, making it more timely, more comprehensive, more developing country input, and how the IPCC can be better integrated here. And this, of course, relates to what the IPCC plenary will talk about this week, is the timing of AR7 in relation to GST2. So yeah, a lot of things to disentangle there. They're also talking about the thematic scope of GST2, especially how it would consider response measures and loss and damage, as well as the timing of these three components of the global stocktake. So that is those seem to be the big issues from my perspective. Parties have been quite bogged down on this since COP28, and the way they are connected with the NDCs and finance makes it pretty difficult to resolve them at a technical level. So perhaps there's a potential unlocking in some kind of cover decision or a package of things to disentangle these. So that's my take on the GST. And since Beth could not be with us, I give the floor to myself for a few words about the two RINGO priorities for this COP. So these are the arrangements for intergovernmental meetings and the research and systematic observation. So in terms of observer engagement and aim, RINGO is spearheading an effort to enhance engagement in the process. A lot of this work happens, of course, in discussions with the Secretariat, the Presidency, and presiding officers, but there's also an agenda item called Arrangements for Intergovernmental Meetings, or AIM. And this is the item that considers, for example, who's going to host the next COPs. It usually happens at the SPs, but it's also going to be on the agenda in Belém this year, and it's going to be SPI item 20. And there'll be a focus on the efficiency of the process, including streamlining agendas, and there's a document from the Secretariat that visualizes options of how you could streamline things. And RINGO has been quite engaged on this. In particular, RINGO's been drawing attention to the challenges created by this ballooning use of party overflow badges. For example, back in June, some parties suggested limits to party delegations, and RINGO provided a submission with an analysis of delegates from both party and party overflow to help give a bit of a context of the number of participants and where they're coming and what would be the benefits for transparency and inclusivity if you limit or change delegation size in some ways. And of course, this is a difficult thing because it's hard to tell parties that they cannot send to the COP who they want to send to the COP. But sometimes there's little developments here. For instance, RINGO had been advocating for getting observers access to rooms before party overflow. And this improvement has been implemented. And there's another small step that parties were encouraged in June to consider the impact of party overflow badges on the overall dynamics of the conference. So there's a bit of hope that there's some openness among parties to discuss that. So RINGO plans to continue to identify how observer engagement is discussed by parties and where we could provide clarity on how observers engage and where we could advocate for more meaningful engagement. And this includes also creating clarity and predictability about how to attend high-level meetings such as the pre-COP and ministerials. So that's one thing, one of the RINGO priorities for COP30. Then there's another one, if we can go to the next slide, and I'm just going to wrap up in a couple of minutes. This is the RSO work streams, and this is perhaps something that, since this relates to research, and this is the main work stream that connects science and research with the party discussions, this is potentially a natural place for RINGO to engage. And the RSO basically operates through two regular events convened by the SubSTA. There's a research dialogue, which happens at the June conference, and this is about research. So this is about latest publications and reports and findings. And here usually there are presentations from the big science organizations, IPCC, WMO, etc., plus breakout groups and discussions with parties. The Secretariat has been trying to make these more diverse and interactive, and there have been more opportunities to provide observer input. The second event is the Earth Information Day, which happens at the COP. It is a similar dialogue, but it's focused on Earth observations. So it's considering how are we monitoring different parameters of the climate system and how could those be improved. And here also there's a similar trend of getting more observer engagement there, which is helpful. And in addition to these events, there's a negotiations at each SubSTA to look at how you could advance the consideration of science and research. And these usually, the interesting thing about these negotiations is that parties usually highlight their research needs. So it's a way for research organizations to look, this is what parties need. Maybe we can help them with those needs. And the final thing to mention is that an interesting development at SubSTA this year was that the SubSTA chair was asked to do a report that maps what the research needs are that parties have outlined since 2004 in the last 20 years, and then how the scientific community has been responding to those needs. I don't think the SubSTA chair can do this comprehensively in 6 months from now, but it might be a good first step towards having a much clearer picture of what the needs are and then how they're being addressed and where the gaps are, and then research organizations could help fill those gaps. This is obviously not a high impact agenda item at COP30, but it is interesting for RINGO since it's a research item, and we've also been exploring whether RINGO can have a more systematic role in supporting this workstream. So now I've talked enough. Thanks everyone, and back to Anna.
Thanks, Mati. And thank you to all our presenters. We've got a final slide here showing you all that you should join our RINGO thematic groups. So plug for that. So I'm going to invite all our presenters to turn their cameras on, and we will jump into our discussion portion of this session. We've already had dozens of questions come in, and especially Axel, but everyone's been busy responding to those in the chat. So hopefully that's been really helpful for you all, and thanks for all the great questions. But there's some that I want to raise, even if they have been answered in the chat, because I'd just be really interested to hear everyone's. It would help if I turned my video on. Let me work on that. Okay, there we go. I would love to get everyone's opinions on these. So the first one I wanted to raise is Mati got to this a little bit, but there's been a couple questions of like, will there be a cover decision? And that's kind of been an evolving trend in recent years. So I wanted to maybe open that up a little bit more broadly to say, like, kind of what are you expecting to see big picture as outcomes from this COP? Maybe if you think a cover decision will be part of that or not. And, what elements do you recommend people kind of keep an eye out for big picture? Why don't we start, Danielle, if it's okay, I'll throw it to you and maybe run through the lineup of folks in the order that you spoke if you want to jump in.
Sure, thanks, Anna. In terms of outcomes, the big outcome on the GGA will be whether or not they accept the indicator list or finalize an indicator list. And not only finalizing the indicator list, because the experts have indicated that this really needs to be a continuing process. There's a lot of what's called metadata needed to decide how the indicators will be tracked and everything. So not only having the indicator list, but having a clear plan going forward on the GGA would be a good outcome from this COP.
Others want to jump in?
Yes, let me come in. So I would agree that the adaptation indicators are actually the high line issue, because it's the only formal stream that is to be completed here at the COP. I followed the workshop in Bonn where parties informally negotiated about the indicators. So there was a trend, especially from the more reactionary group of countries like LMDC, Saudi Arabia, India, to downsize the list of indicators because they said, yeah, some indicators are loss and damage indicators, not adaptation indicators. Other indicators are intrusive because they relate to sovereign decisions of the country. So if one takes up all these requests for deletion of indicators, we would probably end up with a list of 5 or 10 indicators. So the big question will be, is there a possibility for trade-off where developed countries say, look, we are willing to compromise on the means of implementation indicators, but you, LMDCs and others, you compromise on the other indicators. Because the developed countries essentially said, well, the experts have done a lot of work. They've nicely explained how they came to the 100 indicators. Anyway, the list is voluntary, so it doesn't impinge on anyone's sovereignty. So the COP, please adopt the list as is. Because one would not be able now to discuss each of the 100 indicators in the negotiation time that this item will have. So big question, can we get enough pragmatism to agree maybe on a list of 40, 50, and then agree how this could then be expanded over time? Thank you.
Ada, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just come into on that note, and in the vein of sort of the cover decision. Obviously, the Brazilians have not expressed a desire for a cover decision. And it's been difficult because I think a lot of parties want to see the formal negotiated items prioritized. But at the same time, some of the issues that I raised, specifically around the adaptation finance goal that's expiring, and how some of, the initiatives under the GGA indicators would actually come to fruition and be implemented, find the money for that. Because there's no nowhere for this adaptation finance goal to land. That has been one of the things that's come up as, so could a covered decision cover that? And Axel in the chat and in the answered questions has brought up a few times this new language around an omnibus decision or an omnibus text. And so I think, maybe we keep an eye out for what that looks like. But at the same time, I'm still hearing our colleagues in the presidency say that ideally we don't go for a cover decision. So
Damon, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the cover decision issue, yes, it's being raised quite a lot by parties. There are different views on it. All I really say is that the incoming presidency is listening carefully to the different perspectives coming through from parties on it in the context of consultations that they've been doing over recent weeks, including at the pre-COP meetings last week in Brasilia, and considering all that in the context of the priority issues that are coming up, some of which don't have a natural or an agenda item specifically assigned to them. And so some of the issues around finance, around NDC, BTR response, around the trade issues coming up. In terms of other priorities, in terms of mandated negotiated items, some have been touched on, all of them basically in the presentations and the responses, but certainly yes, GGA indicators, along with the sort of broader adaptation focus, the GST items that Matty outlined, the Just Transition one that I focused on, other items like the Technology Implementation Program are being seen as priorities as well, and a few others, but there's a cluster of mandated items that are certainly coming into focus as a key part of the overall package. Thanks.
Matti, over to you.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and great question. I'm gonna, for change, I'm gonna be very optimistic about this business. I think there's a window for a great cover decision actually. That's gonna have 3 building blocks that I think everyone already mentioned. It's gonna bring together these kind of homeless big issues. So there's gonna be some kind of NDC, GST follow-up. There's gonna be something on finance, and the big challenge has always been that what do the LMDCs get? Because they don't really want climate finance. But there's maybe a chance here that this is the place where there's some kind of compromise with the EU on the unilateral trade measures. And then that will sort of round up this triage of very tricky things. I don't know exactly what language you would use and how you bring it together in terms of the process. But I do see that there's a window there for that, and through that having like a high level outcome of the conference. But yeah, that's my unusually optimistic take.
We love to hear optimism. Matti, I actually want to follow up on that because we had a question about unilateral trade measures and like what's the presidency's approach to it, where to look to learn more information about unilateral trade measures. Could you or anyone, we can open it up, share just a little bit more about what that term means and how it might appear? If you think, if it's going to appear in a cover decision potentially, like what could that look like?
I can say a few words, but I think Damon has a much better understanding of this. So I worked a couple of years ago on the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which they announced. It's basically it puts a fee on the carbon content of imports to the EU. And this has been very controversial with developing countries in particular. They say that this violates the convention's principle that climate efforts should not infringe on international trade. And so China and others have kind of criticized this at the WTO, for example, and I think that's one of the reasons why unilateral trade measures is now also in the UNFCCC agenda. But I haven't followed the discussion in details. I believe it's been in the Just Transition room quite a bit.
Damon, you got called out, so I'll turn it over to you.
Fair call. Yeah, I mean, Maddie's right in the sense that it was coming up quite a lot in the Just Transition room in the Bonn session, principally because as part of the resolution of the agenda issues in Bonn, there was a signal sent that the trade-related issues could be discussed under that agenda item as well as other relevant agenda items, and so it became part of the focus there, and it came up in some context as well in the fourth dialogue under the Just Transition work program in Addis Ababa in September. But it's a broader issue than just transition, and it's coming up in the context. I mean, unilateral trade measures. The first thing to say is there's divergence of views in terms of the appropriate framing of the terminology around it. While some refer to it, particularly on the developing countries side, around unilateral trade measures, others like the EU object to that framing and very strongly, and particularly in the context of what Maddie said in relation to CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and they don't accept it. It should be framed as a unilateral trade measure in the context of talking about that. So there's also broader discussion more around the sort of trade environment relationship and discussions around that, and it's come up in other contexts. There's also discussion about the appropriate fora for discussing it, whether it should be in the WTO or other fora outside the UNFCCC, or whether it should be dealt with or visible in some way within the process. And so those discussions will no doubt continue once we get to Belém in terms of reaching some consensus on if and how it should be reflected in the package of outcomes. Thanks.
Very helpful. Thank you. One topic that's been mentioned throughout some of these presentations, but we didn't have a presentation dedicated to it this year, is loss and damage. So I just want to kind of open up the floor if anyone had additional comments on what we might expect to see on loss and damage at COP30. And there were particular questions in the Q&A about any connections into climate finance. And Etta, you may have spoken to that a little bit, but just again, open that up if anyone wants to share insights on loss and damage. Yeah, Damon.
Sorry, I'm happy to start and others come in, but just to frame it, I mean, there's a few contexts with which it will come up. I mean, firstly, there's an item, the WIM review, the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, and the review of the WIM, which didn't conclude last year, and so that's continuing. And the other key areas that are in focus, not necessarily as negotiated items, but in terms of wanting to continue momentum around progress, the Santiago network, and then there's the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. And as part of the discussions around the broader finance priorities, a lot of discussion around the importance of making further progress on the back of the recent board meeting around the further capitalisation and pathway to disbursement from the Loss and Damage Fund for that. So as part of the emphasis of finance related and other support needs, those aspects are certainly coming through in terms of focus for further discussions.
I can say something briefly on just how it relates to the or why I brought it up in the GGA discussion. So just to clarify, there's like a political history behind like the separation of loss and damage and adaptation as agenda items and as issues driven mainly by developing countries who wanted to have loss and damage as a separate agenda item. And that's why when I mentioned kind of the considerations that experts were given in reducing the indicator list for the global goal on adaptation, they were told explicitly not to have loss and damage indicators. And so quite a bit of discussion went into like, how do you ensure that an adaptation indicator is measuring adaptive efforts or adaptation success rather than just measuring impacts over time, so losses or damages over time. But that's largely a political distinction, just to clarify, and that's why you may hear those conversations coming up in the GGA rooms.
Thanks, that's super helpful. Any other L&D comments? Great. Okay, so another question, I'm going to combine a couple questions that came in. There were some comments and questions about how Indigenous peoples and Indigenous lands appear in and around the negotiations, and also kind of how local community voices get incorporated into what we see happening at COP. And I was just wondering if you all could share, it could be either within the negotiations themselves or kind of all that happens around them, how you've observed that being integrated or any expectations you have for this year. It could just be, and it's okay if no one has comments on it, and I think we've already answered it a little bit in the chat, but there is a Indigenous peoples and locals communities agenda item that has been in existence in the past. I'm not sure how much that will be coming up this year, but there's also constituency groups, right, that represent the non-party observers that attend COP. And so there's an Indigenous peoples organization that is one of those constituency groups. So people will see them having representation there. And I think Brazil is also in many ways lifting up Indigenous voices in this COP. So keep an eye out for that as well. But Damon, yeah, please jump in. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I was holding back to give others a chance, but I don't want to sort of dominate the responses. But I mean, just from a just transition perspective, even that's what I was talking about. Certainly, I mean, you're right, Anna, in terms of the constituencies, as an example, in the just transition room, there's a very strong visibility and participation through submissions and other contexts in the work program around these other voices and Indigenous peoples and local communities as part of that, in terms of participation, the dialogues and so on, and also in the negotiations themselves in relation to the draft text or the informal note in its current form. There's reference in there to Indigenous peoples, along with a whole lot of other stakeholders and rights holders in the context of just transition pathways. And so, and for like the high-level ministerial roundtable on just transition as well, there's scope for interventions from the non-party stakeholders as part of that, and certainly a strong presence at previous ones, and we expect that to be an important part of that this year. So it all helps give sort of visibility to those issues and ensuring other ways, in addition to the formal avenues like the ones you've mentioned in the context of those groups and others. Thanks.
Thanks. Melissa, over to you.
Thanks. And yeah, so on this question, so because the RINGOs, as a co-focal point, we get the invitations for nominations with regard to constituent body meetings. And I can tell you that there's an upcoming 14th meeting of the Facilitative Working Group of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. That's happening from the 4th to 7th of November in Belém. And usually there's a quota that comes with these nominations. And I normally ask, Beth and I would ask the Secretariat. And it just so happens that when I asked, they said there's no quota for this meeting. So perhaps that would be an encouraging note. And I note that IPOs have listed many people. They've nominated many to be there in person. So hopefully that will mean a strong showing from communities ahead of the COP.
Thanks, Melissa. That's super helpful. So I think we are kind of getting to the end here. So I wanted to ask a wrap-up question to each of you, which is that a lot of folks that are joining us on this call are researchers or students, and I'm curious if you can share a little bit about your experience going to COP, especially as a researcher, and any tips that you want to share about, how you've gotten the most out of COPs that you've been to, things that you've looked out for as you've been studying this process, just kind of like tips and tricks for people, whether they're going to be there on the ground or they're going to try and follow remotely. So Melissa, as our fearless RINGO leader, maybe I can turn it to you first for a couple pieces of advice, and then we can go around the room.
Thank you. Thanks, Anna. So I'm not going to be at the COP this year. I will be following virtually. But for those of you who are going to be on site, I strongly recommend comfortable shoes. The venue is usually quite large, so you'll be doing a lot of walking. Do orientate yourself when you're on site. Figure out where the areas are, pathways to bathrooms on the way to different meetings. So on and so forth, and bring a lot of snacks, because you'll find if you're tracking I see a lot of knots when I said that. So queues are very long for food, normally at the COPs, and they can be expensive. So I would strongly recommend, if there are no restrictions on food, if you have comfort food, please bring that along with you so that you are comfortable at the COP. Obviously, another tip would be to start taking your vitamins right now. Don't wait until you leave for the COP. So you got to get your immune system up and running well before the COP. And if you're following virtually like myself, I would strongly recommend looking through the annotated agendas. These are a major lifesaver. Those of us who know something about the COP is because we follow these agendas. The annotated ones are excellent to catch up on past documents and decisions as well. And, just use the virtual platform as best as you can. Bookmark the sessions that you want to attend, and I guess set an alarm for it. If you're like me and it's going to be a 12, 13-hour difference, you gotta have some stamina, I think, to follow the COP negotiations virtually. Thanks.
Thanks, Melissa. Danielle, can I throw it to you next?
Sure, yeah. I second everything Melissa said. I'll add to that that the COP can be, whether you're following online or in person, like it's very overwhelming. There's just so much happening all at once. And it can feel like you're missing out on a lot because you just can't possibly follow everything. So just acknowledging that you cannot possibly follow anything and kind of really figuring out what you're interested in, learning more about, / if you're interested in getting kind of a broad range of like getting a sampling of what's going on, then like do that deliberately. But just knowing that you can't follow everything, excuse me, specify your interests, try to focus a little bit, and then also if you want to hear more about everything that's going on, going to those RINGOs meetings, or getting involved in some of the other constituency groups like the Youngos, the youth NGOs, the women and gender group, the ENGOs, the environmental NGOs. Those are places where you can get a lot more information about what's going on.
Damon, sounds like you've been doing this for a while. Any tips for folks that are going for the first time?
Not every year since the 2003 that you mentioned, but every year since 2015 anyway. No, I mean, I agree with what Melissa and Danielle have said in terms of, yes, food, and you certainly can't cover everything. I think for the researchers and those not necessarily as really closely involved in particular negotiating streams, I think really having a plan of attack before you go, as you're there in the first few days, in terms of who you want to meet and what the connections you want to make, and I agree with Danielle. There's so much going on. You've got to have a real focus on a particular aspect of the COP that you think is most valuable for your interests, so it doesn't become overwhelming. And the other thing I'd say for Belém is take plenty of mosquito repellents.
I've heard that tip a couple times. I think that's an important one. Matti, I'll throw it to you, and then we'll give Etta the last word.
Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah. I would just underline the importance of picking maybe 2 or maximum 3 agenda items that you want to follow and stick with those. Don't try to take it all in. It's overwhelming for everybody. And then what Melissa said about reading the pre-sessional documents is really important, because otherwise you can't follow what the negotiators start doing in the first meeting. Additional thing, if you go as a researcher and if you're planning to do interviews, which I've heard from several people, here you have the timing is really important. Most people at the COP are extremely busy and it's hard to catch them, especially the party delegates. But then during the COP, usually there are these strange lulls where things quiet down, especially if there's an agenda fight, then suddenly everyone's kind of loitering. and waiting for things to start moving, and that's the time when you can actually, it's easier to talk to people. Never try to talk to party delegates during the high level segment. They are all around the place. They are very nervous. They have to follow their ministers all around the place. So that's another thing. And then of course when you're waiting for the closing plenary, I mean, usually every COP goes a couple of days over time. Those 2 days can be very conducive, although at that point everyone's so tired that they might not be giving useful input. And then I would be, if you plan to interview party delegates, for example, you have to be a little bit careful. You have to prepare and understand where they are coming from, and then pick the right timing to talk to them, so that you don't want to, kind of get into awkward situations with people. Yeah.
All right. I will echo everything everyone has said already. And instead of repeating it, I'll say I'm shocked that none of our RINGO colleagues have also plugged the importance of RINGO and the constituency groups, and relying on our fellow researchers when other information is difficult to find. So in those lulls that Maddie mentioned, or particularly in week 2, as a lot of the negotiations go behind closed doors, if you have contacts, or if you're interested in getting involved in RINGO, I think that there will be often conversations happening over WhatsApp and other informal groups. And so those can be very helpful. And as someone who will be following remotely this year, is something that I intend to do. So over back to you, Anna.
Thanks, Etta. And yes, thank you for the shout out. I agree. I first attended COP as an undergraduate student and then as a graduate student, and found RINGO to be just such a useful place to find other researchers that were interested in similar topics and who wanted to stay connected throughout COP and year round. And so we have a number of ways through RINGO for folks to do that. So please do join us at the morning coordinating meetings to find those buddies and the folks that are following similar things, and also join our thematic groups as a really great way to stay connected with folks working on this year round. With that, I will say thank you so much to our speakers today. Thank you to everyone behind the scenes who made this possible. Hopefully this was really helpful information for you all who joined us, and we got lots of questions about if this is recorded and posted. It'll be on the Second Nature website and the RINGO website in just a couple of days. But we are so excited that you joined us to get this information, and we are really looking forward to continuing to engage with you during COP, and as I said, year round as well. You can find all of those opportunities that Etta mentioned on the RINGO website. And also, basically, everyone who's on this call's organizations do a lot of work around COP. So check out my organization, EESI, does a daily newsletter during COP. So does C2ES. Woodwell does tons of work during COP as well, as do so many of the universities that we have represented here today. And of course, the UNFCCC is running it all. So take a look for all those resources online as well. Thank you to Second Nature, University Climate Change Coalition, and RINGO Steering Committee for the work to make this happen. And with that, thanks for joining us, and we will see you at COP30. Hope everyone has a great rest of your day or evening.